Western and Ukrainian media, when talking about the causes of the war, say that in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, occupying parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. They also say that Ukrainians have united and every Ukrainian is ready to fight Russia. However, I live in a different reality. I am surrounded by people from Donetsk and Mariupol. Firstly, a significant part of the population isn't interested in politics. But generally speaking, in Mariupol people like Russia and don't understand Ukraine, considering Ukrainians to be deceived fools. And in Donetsk many simply hate everything associated with Ukraine and enjoy reading news about blackouts in Kiev. That's why my experience is completely different from the Western media story. But the most important is that all pro-Ukrainian sources call in 2014 events a Russian invasion, which is a lie, or at least a manipulation. Forgetting about 2014 civil war leads to wrong conclusions about the reasons of this conflict. Even if you believe the Ukrainian narrative that the rebellion was organized by Russia, most of the militiamen were Ukrainian citizens, which alone makes it a civil war. And Ukraine did everything to convince everyone that it was a war with Russia. I found very interesting article from 2016. Its main point is that Ukraine becomes totalitarian. The boldest predictions of George Orwell's 1984 have come to pass. Phrases like civil war have become taboo. In their place we have newspeak. In particular, the newspeak term hybrid war. And in 2021, Ukraine introduced a law about denying Russian aggression. If you said that the people of Donbass rebelled on their own, you could be fined. The main idea of this video is to show that 2014 conflict was a civil war in Ukraine, and I will also talk about Ukrainians who fight in Ukraine after 2022, and a bit about modern Ukrainian society. Now I want to say thank you to all of my sponsors. If you want me to increase the quality of content, you can support me by the link in the description. The confrontation between nationalists and pro-Russian Ukrainians began long before 2014. I'm using the term pro-Russians for simplicity, but in reality there were many different groups, most of which didn't want Ukraine to join Russia. They simply wanted it to be a friend of Russia. There were many powers like communists or anti-fascists who also confronted nationalists. Speaking about nationalist organizations, almost all of them were far-right and used Nazi symbols. So there were dozens of organizations that supported a pro-Russian path for Ukraine. These groups promoted different ideas, such as making Russian a second state language. Again, these organizations were very diverse. Some were leftist, others right-wing. Many of them were openly pro-Russian, such as the Russian Bloc, based in Crimea, Motherland from Dnieper, Dozor from Odessa, and dozens of others. In Ukraine there were 13 officially registered pro-Russian political parties and far more public organizations. Sometimes there were clashes between pro-Russian and nationalist organizations. For example, the incident in Lvov on May 9, 2011. Members of the neo-Nazi Svoboda party attempted to disrupt the celebrations of the Victory Day by engaging in clashes with police, throwing plastic bottles at them and attacking World War II veterans. Activists from pro-Russian organizations, based in Odessa and Dnieper, clashed with nationalists, and such cases happened frequently. The government was more or less neutral, sometimes detaining nationalists, sometimes detaining pro-Russian activists, but without serious consequences. There was a balance. Everything changed in 2014, after the Euromaidan. During the Euromaidan, nationalist organizations united into a single group called the Right Sector and overthrew the government. The Right Sector was an ultranationalist organization led by open neo-Nazis who were hostile towards ethnic Russians and Ukrainians from the eastern regions. Many of its members demanded a complete breakup with Russia, a rejection of shared history and the Soviet past, and many other things. People on the east of Ukraine didn't like the new government, so the anti-Maidan movement appeared in the eastern cities, uniting all those who opposed the new government. Nationalists wanted to send their fighters to suppress dissent. In Crimea, a Russian army and special forces helped locals, so Crimea became part of Russia. The Donbass, however, was less fortunate. But this video is not about the history of Ukraine in 2014. I want to focus on the facts that the Western narrative simply ignores. So now I will explain why this was a civil war and not a Russian hybrid invasion. There were Russian troops in Crimea, so here the Western point of view is at least understandable. But when we are talking about the Donbas, there is no confirmed evidences that Russia used its regular army. Russian volunteers fought for Donbas, and Russia helped DPR with supply, most likely with weapons, and probably even sent Russian commanders. But I found no verified evidence that regular Russian units fought there, so it's a very debatable topic. Anyway, it isn't the point of this video, because even if some units of Russian army fought in Donbas, it doesn't change the fact that the main power were locals, Ukrainian citizens. Initially, protesters in eastern Ukraine weren't calling to break away from Ukraine or join Russia. They simply wanted the federalization of Ukraine, so that eastern regions would have more autonomy and the Russian language would gain official status. However, the new Ukrainian government first tried to simply crush the protests and then sent the army. After that, people in the Donbas had many reasons to fight against Ukraine. First, the tragedy in Odessa, where Ukrainian nationalists burned pro-Russian activists alive. Second, volunteer battalions like Azov or Aidar, which Ukraine sent to fight the rebels. These battalions consisted of neo-Nazis. And third, a lot of war crimes committed both by neo-Nazis from these battalions and by regular Ukrainian soldiers. And even though back then I was just a child, I was 9 years old, I remember that most people supported Russia. My relatives, the parents of my friends and classmates, my parents' acquaintances, all voted in the referendum for separation from Ukraine. A lot of the people I knew were personally acquainted with someone from the militia. And there were very few who supported Ukraine, although I knew some of those as well. Now about the facts that can be verified. Ukrainians say the conflict was started by Russia because one of the first militia leaders was Igor Strelkov, a former FSB colonel who retired in 2013. Strelkov himself said in an interview that if it weren't for him, this war wouldn't have happened, and of course Ukrainians believe that. Why would he lie? Yet in that same interview, he states that he acted independently of the Russian government. Ukrainians don't believe that part. He also says he recruited mostly local volunteers for the militia, a fact that Ukrainians simply ignore. Also, according to him, in his unit, with which he crossed the border, Russians were a minority. There were even several people from Western Ukraine. Now let's look at the facts. The protests in Donbas began back in February, and the rebels started seizing administrative buildings on April 6. Strelkov crossed the border with his unit on April 12th, meaning the uprising began without him. Moreover, almost all militia leaders were locals. The first head of the DPR, Alexander Zakharchenko, was an ordinary miner from Donetsk. I'm not even talking about the thousands of people at the rallies who obviously weren't brought by Russia. By the way, on my channel I have an interview with a guy from Mariupol who was in the DPR militia in 2014, and a detailed video about the rebellion in Mariupol. And if you find news reports from 2014, even Ukrainian sources admit that the protesters were local. In my other videos I've already mentioned an article from Ukrainskaya Pravda, which publishes Ukrainian propaganda. The November 2014 article states, in May, 70% of population supported pro-Russian separatists. Now, those waiting for the DPR arrival are about 30%. Another roughly 30% are for Ukraine. All the rest are undecided. The same article says that in Mariupol people were disappearing, with some of them later found to be detained by the SBU. In any case, there are a lot of photos and videos from the May 11th referendum from different cities. Here you can see photos from Mariupol. By the way, protests happened not only in Donbas and Odessa, but also in Kharkov, Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, etc. Western sources pretend that all these uprisings were organized by Russia. At the same time, they call the Euromaidan the Ukrainian people's will for freedom, ignoring the fact that it was funded by the European Union and organizations like USAID. That's the double thing. When nationalists stormed administrative buildings in the Western Ukraine, that was the people's will. And when people in the East did the same, that was Russian influence. So 2014 events were a civil war between the Ukraine and people of Donbas. Now let's talk about the methods Ukraine used to suppress pro-Russian citizens. The new Ukrainian government not only refused to make any concessions, but also declared all those who disagreed to be terrorists. And of course there were repressions. In 2014 many people disappeared in Mariupol. There were posters asking people to report to the SBU anyone who supported Russia. The Ukrainian authorities started pretending that the rebels were a minority, that they were Russian agents, and so on. Ukraine officially recognized the DPR and LPR as terrorist organizations. But worst of all, the nationalists started stirring up very strong hatred towards all separatists. I won't be able to show the worst examples because of YouTube's rules, but when civilians were dying in Donbass from Ukrainian army shellings, Ukrainians either tried to deny Ukraine's guilt or simply said they deserved it. Here is the famous speech by the Ukrainian President Poroshenko, where he says that the children of Donetsk will sit in basements while Ukrainian children will go to school. Many Ukrainians say that this phrase is taken out of context and that Poroshenko only meant that people in the East won't be able to build a normal life because they don't know how to do anything. A wonderful situation when a president in an official speech says that part of Ukraine's citizens is worse than the others. And there are many such examples. Hatred to Eastern Ukrainians was also shown in actions. Besides the shelling of Donbass by the Ukrainian army, the clearest example of the attitude towards former compatriots is the blockade of Crimea. 7 months after Crimea joined Russia, Ukraine continued to supply it with electricity, which was paid for by Russia. And then Ukrainian nationalist organizations blew up power lines several times, after which Ukraine officially stopped the electricity supply, leading to blackouts in Crimea. How do you think these blackouts affected Crimeans' attitude towards Ukraine? The electricity problem in Crimea was only solved in 2016, when Russia integrated Crimea into its power grid. Ukraine also blocked roads for food supplies to Crimea. And just like with electricity, first nationalist activists set up a blockade, and then President Poroshenko officially banned trade with Crimea. There was also a water blockade of Crimea, and Russia was only able to completely solve this problem in 2022, when the Kherson region came under its control. In short, Crimeans have many reasons to love Ukraine. Back in 2014, Ukrainians still understood that that was a civil war. But both the official Ukrainian propaganda and popular figures first started calling the people of Donbass separatists and Colorados. And a few years later they started pretending that the cities had been captured by Russia against the will of the residents. Since Ukraine is good at making quality propaganda, many Ukrainians really believe this. I can still understand the people from central or western Ukraine who have never been to Donetsk, but I've talked to people from Mariupol who think the same way. According to the Minsk agreements, Ukraine was supposed to reintegrate the DPR and LPR, but give them autonomy and certain rights, as well as amnesty the participants of the uprising. The nationalists declared this a surrender, and when in 2019 Zelensky wanted to start implementing the agreements, activists began holding protests under the slogan "No surrender." Between 2015 and 2022, Ukraine was preparing for war with Russia and suppressing all alternative opinions. You know, if you decided to destroy your country, first you need to get rid of those who don't like this idea. There was opposition in the country, forces that advocated for implementing the Minsk agreements and for the rights of the Russian language, but these forces were suppressed. For example, the party OPZZ was the second or third most popular. In the 2019 presidential elections, the candidate from this party was the most popular in Donbass. Activists of this party were constantly attacked by nationalists, and in 2021, Ukraine imposed sanctions against its leader and shut down its TV channels. Another example of opposition in Ukraine is Anatoly Shary. He is a blogger from Kiev who disagreed with the new government's actions. He also didn't like nationalists. You couldn't call him pro-Russian, but he was against neo-Nazi organizations and called civil war a civil war. Criminal cases were opened against him several times, and when he created his own party, its members were often attacked by nationalists. Like the opposite, this party was finally banned after the war started in 2022. Overall, from 2014 to 2022, Ukraine was gradually turning into a kamikaze drone against Russia. The changes were smooth, but significant. The main one was propaganda. The population was instilled with hatred for Russia and the idea that Ukrainians and Russians were never brothers. That Crimea and Donbas were occupied by Russia without reason. There was also a rejection of common culture, suppression of the Russian language, and suppression of the opposition. In short, everything was done to forcibly unite the country by pretending that Ukrainians with a different opinion don't exist, and never did. When the war began, totalitarianism was finally established in Ukraine. All opposition parties were simply banned. All TV channels were shut down, only one remained. North Korea has 4 TV channels. Those who spoke for peace were persecuted, some by the SBU, some by activists. This summer I translated a documentary about totalitarianism where all this is described in detail. In general, a kind of hysteria began in Ukrainian society. Belief in Ukraine's victory, the defeat of Moscow, a trial for Putin, and so on. And anyone who expressed a different opinion was declared an enemy. If someone is not interested in politics, society will condemn or even harass him. And if someone says that the Ukrainian government is also to blame, that the situation is not black and white, they can easily be hounded, and if they are lucky, they'll just be forced to apologize on camera. If they are unlucky, anything can happen to them. And this applies to any alternative point of view. In Ukraine, you can't say that the Minsk agreements should have been fulfilled, that it was good for Ukraine to be neutral and receive investment from both Russia and the European Union. There is an official opinion: Russia is evil, we must fight it. No doubts allowed. A neutral person is also an enemy. Therefore, the Ukrainian government pretends that pro-Russian Ukrainians never existed and don't exist. Of course, there were some traitors, but they make up about 1% of the population, and in any case, Russia paid them. They also erase famous Ukrainians who were against nationalism. For example, Bulgakov, a great writer who was born in Kiev. He is being simply crossed out. Monuments are demolished and they try to make people forget. They also demolish monuments to Ukrainian communists, of whom there were many, because the Soviet Union was a Russian occupation. Ukrainians couldn't possibly have supported it. But pro-Russian people haven't disappeared. Of course, many have left for Russia or European Union countries. It's not just about politics. Ukraine is also a very poor country. However, many pro-Russian Ukrainians remain in Ukraine. They can't speak publicly, but they exist. I've personally spoken with a few. I feel sorry for these people and I understand I could have been in their place. Ukraine's borders are closed for men over 22, so they either flee illegally or wait for the war to end to leave. There are also those who help Russia. Some send data about military facilities or about Ukrainian army unit locations to Russian intelligence. Many Ukrainian soldiers say that the residents of Donbas are simply waiting for the Russian army and hate Ukraine. Here are a couple of videos from 2022-2023.
Під Києвом, Чернігівській області, там справжні українці, всі допомагали і нам розказували, де знаходиться дня. А тут ці всі колаборанти, ці всі нелюди, вони навпаки здають всі наші позиції, розказують, куди треба влучити.
І там, звичайно, що там певна частина намагалася допомагати, вони там молоко носили. А в деяких селах, ну ми, наприклад, приїжджаємо на точку, розвертаємо там Starlink, ми аеророзвідка, якийсь іде там такий дідусь з велосипедом поруч, такий проходить. І через півгодини точніком просто от в наш райончик кладуться один за одним міна, або гради, або танчик. Тобто і кілька разів таке було.
Some people remain in cities through which the front line passes. They sign a written refusal to evacuate and wait for the Russian army. It's very risky, but if such people manage to survive, Russia takes care of them. Here you can see a video of a family from Volchansk, a couple and their daughter who survived a year and a half of street fightings, after which they were saved by the Russian army. Don't ask me why or how, I don't know, and that report shocked me. I survived for 2 months, and during the second month, Mariupol began to come back to life. And still I can't imagine living 1.5 years like that. There are thousands of such cases in places like Pokrovsk or Guliai Polye. There are pro-Russian people in Kiev. Recently I saw an interesting piece of news from a Ukrainian source. In Kiev, at a monastery, there was an underground school where children studied from Soviet textbooks, sang Russian songs, and watched Soviet movies. 60 children studied there, taught by 19 teachers. There was a scandal in the Ukrainian media because this is a crime in modern Ukraine. The SBU started an investigation. Although what's wrong with it if the parents themselves send their children there? Ukraine has turned a lot of people against itself. When you ban a language that is native for the majority of the population, it's logical that not everyone will like it. Some will leave Ukraine and forget it like a bad dream. Some will make videos for YouTube about Ukraine, and some will fight it. Ukraine's policy of suppressing second opinion has led many Ukrainians to develop a hatred for Ukraine itself. Russians don't like Zelensky and the Ukrainian government, but mostly they sympathize with Ukrainians or simply don't think about this war. But in the new territories of Russia, especially the parts that separated in 2014, the residents of Kiev or Western Ukraine are openly hated. Now let's talk about Ukrainians who are fighting Ukraine. There are DPR and LPR militia, Sudoplatov battalion, and Maxim Krivonos detachment. I will not talk about Crimeans because I don't know any reason to consider them Ukrainians, but there are a lot of them in the Russian army as well. Now a few words about DPR and LPR militia to make it clear. A lot of people in the DPR and LPR were conscripted. Yes, there were conscription in 2022, and for some reason it was only in the territory which was controlled by the DPR and LPR since 2014. There was nothing like this in Mariupol or Volnovakha. That was a forced conscription, and it was terrible for Donetsk because a lot of men were sent to the front line against their will, and a lot of men just stayed home and hid it before autumn when conscription ended. But unlike in Ukraine, where TTSK just kidnapping men from streets, the mobilization in DPR was carried out according to the law. People received draft notices and were required to report to the military enlistment office. Draft dodgers could be imprisoned. But that doesn't change the fact that many residents of Donetsk went as volunteers. After all, they were defending their land and their city. And many went for the money. The salaries in the DPR army weren't sky high, but they were significantly above average. Conscription in Donetsk was over in October 2022. But Ukrainian officials saying that it's still ongoing. Like the former head of Ukrainian intelligence Budanov says that there is Russian TTSK, which is operating in the occupied territories. And according to him, Russia ran out of missiles back in 2022. Also, Ukrainian news outlets often claim that mobilization in these territories will begin in a couple of months. They have been repeating this every couple of months since 2022. They have their own reality. Let's return to Ukrainians who are fighting Ukraine. Besides the militias of the DPR and LPR, there is also the Sudoplatov battalion, formed from volunteers of the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. There is also the Maxim Krivonos detachment, which was formed from captured Ukrainian soldiers who agreed to fight on the Russian side. Also, there are many volunteers from Ukraine in other units of the Russian armed forces. And according to Ukrainian data, every 6th prisoner of war taken by Ukraine is a Ukrainian citizen. By the way, the article in the screenshot is fake. It talks about some mobilization in Crimea, but, there are freaks who comment under my videos about TTSK that the same happening in Russia. Let's just go on. Now about the consequences of Ukrainian policy, which no one is talking about. Because of Ukrainian totalitarianism, the Ukrainian language is associated with supporting Ukrainian actions, which means supporting the suicidal war. Any channel in the Ukrainian language either collects donations for armed forces of Ukraine or simply supports the war against Moscow. And in the comments people wish death to all Russians. Of course, in the villages and small towns of the Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye regions, many speak Ukrainian. And in the south of Russia there are Ukrainian-speaking areas, and Ukrainian-speaking people are treated normally. In 2023 in Russian Mariupol I had a mandatory Ukrainian language lesson at school. Later it was cancelled, but parents can still choose it as an optional subject. And yet for anyone this language is associated with crazy people who hate Russia. And this has happened to all Ukrainian symbols. For example, the Ukrainian flag, which has become a symbol of support for the war with Russia. And there is no alternative Ukraine. For Ukrainians who are able to think, the choice is either not to think about politics at all, or to support Russia, or to hate both sides. Many would like to see a neutral Ukraine, Novorossiya, Malorossiya, but now there is only Russia and Ukraine. In Donbass, the word Ukrainian, depending on the context, can mean those who support the Ukrainian government, those who live in Ukraine, or soldiers of the Ukrainian army. And although almost all residents of Donbass were born in Ukraine, Ukrainians here are either hated or pitied, and this has nothing to do with ethnicity. Again, Ukrainians have no choice. You can't support Ukraine but consider Crimea Russian. You can't be for a neutral Ukraine. Well, in theory you can, but there are almost no such people. If you support a neutral Ukraine, Ukrainians will hate you, and Russians simply won't understand you. To make a conclusion, in 2014, Ukraine made a huge mistake by making Russophobia its national idea. Hatred of everything Russian and total propaganda united Ukraine, but that also made many Ukrainians hate their country. By refusing all compromise and dehumanizing those who held different views, Ukraine turned itself into a single-use weapon against Russia. I don't know what will happen to Ukraine in the future, but I think nothing good. Most likely it can resist for another year, or even several years, paying with Ukrainian lives and European money, but the outcome of this war is obvious to me. And that was all for today. I hope you found this video interesting. I put a lot of efforts into it. If you want to support this channel, you can leave a like, a comment, or send me a donation by the link in the description.